For tomorrow in class, we're going to go over some extra practice in factoring from section 8.4, 8.5, and 8.8, actually, so let's correct that. That's 8.8. 8.4 was factoring when my a value was equal to 1. 8.5 was factoring when my a value did not equal 1. And 8.8 was factoring with 4 terms, as we knew, factoring by grouping. So rule number 1 of always factoring is see if your terms have a greatest common factor. In the case below, we do. We have a common factor of a 2. So I'm going to factor out the 2 and rewrite what remains. So I have 2 times x squared minus 16x plus 63. Now, this has now become a problem where my a value is equal to 1. There's not a number there, as you can see highlighted in red. So this was the very basic first way we learned how to factor in these 3 sections. What I would do for this one is I still need to keep the 2 there, but I need to come up with the 2 parentheses. I need to think of the 2 numbers that multiply to give me 63 and combine to give me negative 16. So thinking that through, you might play around with a couple numbers in your head, but ultimately you should find it to be negative 9 and negative 7. Now my final answer, including that 2, is circled below in the blue. For this problem, the first thing we'll check to see is if each term has a greatest common factor. Looking at the 2x cubed minus 7x squared plus 16x minus 56, we don't notice any greatest common factor, so we move on to our next step. Next step would be to recognize what situation we have. Here we have 4 terms. With 4 terms, we're going to want to do factoring by grouping. So what I'm going to do is group my first 2 terms together, as you see in red, and my second 2 terms together, as you see in blue. Starting with the red terms, we need to figure out what do those 2 terms have in common. They have an x squared in common. What remains is going to be a 2x minus 7. Let's move to the blue. What do the blue terms have in common? To me, it appears they have an 8 in common, and I'm going to be left with a 2x minus 7. Now, as we know, this is a good thing to have. What I'm underlining right now is a 2x minus 7. That occurs twice. So what we're going to do is write it down once. 2x minus 7. What will be next to that is going to be the x squared plus 8. And we have completed a factoring by grouping problem. Now keep in mind there's a lot of situations where things can change in this problem, such as depending on if this sign was negative, we would have had to factor out a negative number. There's also the situation where it appears we can't factor out any greatest common factor. We still need to consider that we can factor out a 1. For this next problem, we need to double check to make sure there is no greatest common factor. Between 3x squared minus 19x plus 20, I don't see a greatest common factor. Do you? Nope, there isn't one. Now we're going to notice that we have 3 terms. So we know we're going to be factoring when a is not equal to 1. So we're going to need to use the AC method. I'm going to take my a value and multiply it to my c value. 3 times 20. I end up getting 60. Now I need to think of 2 numbers that multiply to give me 60 and combine to give me negative 19. Now keep in mind the multiplication has to give me positive 60, and it's going to have to combine to give me negative 19. Think about that for a second. If you haven't thought of it by now, your 2 numbers are going to be 15 and 4, and it's going to be a negative 15 and a negative 4. So the AC method tells me to break up this piece as a minus 15x and a minus 4x. Now I need to carry the 3x squared and the positive 20 along with me. Now you notice I have 4 terms. With 4 terms, I do factoring by grouping. I'm going to go ahead and group my first 2 terms in yellow and my second 2 terms in blue. Looking at my first 2 terms, I need to determine what do these have in common. They each have a 3x. What remains is going to be an x minus 5. Taking a look at my blue terms, it's important to notice that I have a negative term first, so I'm going to definitely need to pull out a negative. The common factor that these 2 have is a 4, so it's a negative 4 that they share. Now if I take it out a negative sign, I need to take into effect that each sign is going to change. So taking out a negative 4 from 4x, I'll be left with x, and finally a 5. Now, as we've always noticed, these 2 terms are the same. That is a good thing. we will now have x minus 5 times 3x minus 4. This is our final answer, and this concludes one example of all three types. Tomorrow in class, you're going to be given a worksheet with all these examples on it. However, I'm not going to tell you what method you need to use. You need to recognize how many terms you have and what situation you have in order to determine how to do the problem. Have a good evening. Bye.